I'm Reverend Carrie Parker, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and I'm delighted to be able to bring to you today a continuing education opportunity that's part of the Wisconsin Council of Churches' racial equity efforts. We have been committed for a long time to ensuring that churches have resources to work on issues of nonviolence and issues of racial equity from an individual and a systemic standpoint. Our presenter today is the Reverend Dr. Zachary Moon from Chicago Theological Seminary. He's the Assistant Professor of Pastoral Theology and Care. He has had many roles in his professional life, including military chaplain with Marines and sailors, a chaplain resident in the VA hospital system, and chaplain with combat veterans in residential treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. His research interests touch on some of these same areas. His background includes being raised in the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, and he's currently ordained in the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ. His journey has taken him through pacifism to working with folks who have left journeys of violence to deal with that trauma. But I will let him tell more of his own story as it suits him as he is working with us. Reverend Dr. Moon's the author of Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injuries and Identities in Crisis, and Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families. I'm also pleased to say that we both graduated together from Chicago Theological Seminary, so I am grateful that we were able to make this connection to bring this resource to you today. Zachary, the time is all yours. Friends, if you would like to make comments or offer questions while Professor Moon is teaching, you are welcome to use the chat box. I will monitor those questions and I will bring those to Professor Moon after he presents.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which has a presentation to share with you, although it says that the host will have to enable my screen sharing. So, Reverend Carrie, I might need your help with that.
I will get going on that.
Okay.
Done.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you're seeing my screen. This is a presentation that really emerged out of conversations over this last couple of weeks, really talking about everything that's been happening most recently here, and in truth has actually been happening for years and decades and centuries when we think about the history of the United States. And I think the question for me in the midst of all of this is, among other things, you know, one of the pieces of this vision that's very clear to me is when we're actually able to take steps forward as a society, those are moments that are almost always characterized by multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural coalition building that takes place there. So I come at this from a commitment that there are many pieces of work that go into that kind of coalition building. I think one of those is for those of us who inhabit white bodies, who would be identified as white, to have the necessary conversations that better prepare ourselves to participating equitably in those kinds of coalitions. And so I hope that the content today, to be clear, is not really meant to answer all of the questions about hundreds of years of American racism, but is really meant to give us, hopefully, enough of a framework that we can think about how white folks are participating at this particular moment, and what it means to be yoked within this this particular social construction of what race is. And to do that, I'm going to begin with this story that I think probably most of us are very familiar with. It's a story that is taught to most kids in vacation Bible school, at probably some of the places where I learned this story first. It's the story of Jacob and Esau. And this story has been on my mind as I have wondered once again about questions of racial reconciliation and some of the language around racial unity. This is a particular image that has shown up a lot through social media and other places. And when I see an image like this, it seems to symbolize to me some of that kind of coalition building that I'm deeply committed to. And as much as it does, it raises a certain kind of hope, which I think is certainly necessary to do this kind of justice building work. But I will also say to you that there's something about this image that seems complicated to me when I think about, as I say, centuries of American history that in which white folks and black folks have been deeply pitted against each other in the name of a racist agenda. So when I see an image like this, it also raises certain questions for me. You know, who are these folks? How did they come to take a hold of each other this way? Do they know each other? You know, what are the terms of their relationship? I wonder about this, and it's those questions that also take me to a question and an image like this one, right? This is an artistic depiction of this embracing moment that takes place between Jacob and Esau, seemingly the kind of culmination of their relationship. It is a moment of reconciliation, but it's also a moment that has a lot of history to it, right? These folks are not just, you know, the best of friends, the best of siblings. Hey, it's great to see you at another Thanksgiving. You know, this is a relationship that has been deeply strained, deeply stressed, where there has been, I would say, immense wrongdoing has transpired because of Jacob's deceit in this relationship. And so to celebrate this moment, to feel hopefulness in this moment, to feel a sense of the power of forgiveness, even the power of redemption in an image in a moment like this within our biblical narrative, it makes me want to kind of go back and read the story again. What does this embrace really mean? And is it enough to just sort of celebrate it and say, wow, you know, the power of forgiveness is here. Esau must have been, you know, such a wonderful person to be able to do this. Or can we drill down a little bit on how Jacob participates in this relationship, both to really kind of put the kind of stress and strain on this relationship, but then ultimately, what are those steps that allow him to kind of come back and reconnect with his brother in this way? And so for me, it's this question: what does the story of Jacob and Esau, the story of this particular relationship that we get over a series of chapters in the book of Genesis, what could it teach us? What could it illuminate about how racism works in our society today? And what could it teach us or illuminate about the process of working to dismantle racist systems as well? So let's begin with some of those first chapters, right, where we first meet Jacob and Esau. The first image that we get of them is in this birth moment, right? We already know that there's something about this relationship that's going to be a little extra complicated, a little strange, because the first thing we hear about these two is that Jacob is grasping at the heel, right? It's like he's already trying to pull something out of Esau, but it's actually Esau who sort of then kind of pulls him from the womb in this way. I see this as being an interesting kind of depiction, a story about power and privilege, about, in this case, we see it sort of through the lens of a particular family system. We see a mother and a father with their relationships with their sons respectively, and how that works. I think there's a way in which we are sort of meant to be suspicious or even judgmental of these kinds of deceitful choices that Jacob makes. And yet Jacob is also was one of these sort of enormous patriarchal figures in this book of Genesis that really lays the foundation for so much of the Judeo-Christian tradition and even beyond. So these images are powerful, and I think there's a way in which within our tradition we also I don't know, celebrate or commend the kind of scheming, cunning, mischievous resourcefulness that Jacob from a very early age displays. But it's also clear from this narrative that when it comes to being the sort of prototypical male, Esau is much better at this role, right? He's the outdoorsy type, you know. He's out having kind of adventures. He's out hunting. He's larger in physique, right? I mean, he's the picture here. You know, he's Dwayne Johnson, right? That's who's going to get cast in the movie. And then we have, you know, little, you know, Gary Sinise, right? Somebody of a much slighter build, somebody who's a little bit, you know, not making the varsity football team in Jacob. And it says in the narrative that he, you know, really prefers to spend his time indoors, right? I mean, there's certain kinds of judgments, I think, that are being made in this kind of characterization. But then this sort of interesting thing happens, which is we understand, if we didn't understand by Jacob grasping at Esau's heel, we certainly understand as they come into adolescence that Jacob is really angling to maneuver himself around some of the dynamics of power and privilege. And some of that has to do with his brother, some of it has to do with his father, but certainly within the family system. And he gets enabled in some of that motivation from his mom, who's very much in his corner. But we get this particular part of the story where Esau kind of comes back from doing, you know, all of his really outdoorsy, adventure-y kinds of things, and he's hungry, right? We get this image of very natural kind of human need, right? Hunger, I need sustenance, and Jacob is there working on some tasty food to eat, and Esau says, "Hey, that looks great to me." And Jacob says, "How great does it look to you? You know, are you feeling interested in a sort of transaction at this moment? Because this is some great stew, but what I'm angling for here is not to feed you, but actually to advantage myself." And so what ends up happening in this transactional moment is Esau turns over a birthright, the thing that Jacob seemingly desires more than anything, and maybe from the very beginning, from the very first moments of their life, has been really coveting in this kind of way. And in fact, that scheme works so well that a couple of chapters later in Genesis, he gets basically the same scheme going, but this time with his father. That there's a sort of second part to this kind of privileging. One is the birthright, and he's already attained that from his brother in this one food-related transaction. And now he says, "Man, this stew has really got it going on. Let me see this if I can also work this hustle on my dad as well. And to do so, he not only relies on his culinary prowess, but he also disguises his body. There's a kind of manipulation of bodies that happen in this moment that end up being kind of crucial to the maneuvering of what takes place. And lo and behold, this does work. But even as he has attained this privilege, it also really immediately serves as a kind of curse in his life. He basically then spends years and years more or less on the run, constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly anticipating that he may, that all of his scheming may catch up to him. And that in fact, those that he is disadvantaged, first and foremost Esau, but then later his father-in-law Laban, who he also works a pretty good hustle on there in the text. He's constantly looking over his shoulder, considering what reprisal would look like, and maybe violent reprisal. I think he particularly anticipates in terms of his relationship with his brother. And this is crucial, because how we as persons behave when we're scared like that is a pretty powerful thing, right? When we're either consciously or even unconsciously living our lives out of a deep-seated fear that we may in fact have been the agents of some perpetuation of injustice, that we may be responsible for some injustice, and having a sense that that could catch up with us in some ways. And what it means in the case of Jacob's story is that he just is on the run, and he stays on the run. And then this amazing thing happens in the story, and that is the flight, the run that he's been on, it runs out, and Esau catches up with him. And this is years later. He's got a whole crew of kind of family and people with him. He's got animals. He's got certain kinds of material wealth and well-being, but nothing is gonna shield him from what this encounter is gonna bring. And he's anticipating that. And it's really clear as I reread the text, again, thinking with some of these questions about their relationship, that Jacob is really trembling. I mean, he's really deeply afraid of what's going to happen in this moment. And that's what's happening, right? That's the foreshadowing to what happens in this very evocative, maybe the part of the story that we know the best, that we tell most often, is this kind of incredible narration of this long night of wrestling, and beautiful, magnificent questions about who exactly Jacob is wrestling with. Some say he's wrestling with himself, some say an angel, some say God, some are kind of unwilling to entertain any of these questions. But I mean, this is like a big, magnificent, sort of existential wrestling that's taking place. And wrestling and wrestling and wrestling, and neither entity in this confrontation proves victorious. That there's something that remains unfinished in this way. That as a part of that, Jacob is injured. Also, as a part of that, Jacob receives this new name. So we hold in the kind of conclusion, not exactly any finality, but almost a kind of new beginning that takes place with the kind of renaming of Jacob now being given this name Israel in that moment, but also this wounding, a wound that is said that he will kind of continue to limp. He will continue to carry this wound on his body for the rest of his life, and in this ongoing kind of way. I think both of those are evocative to me when I think about what we may have to learn in this moment. And he wakes up or watches the sun come up, since he's been wrestling all night, And 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 then here comes his brother, right, that he had been anticipating in these days leading up to this. But I want to slow down here, kind of before we hurry on to this, very cinematic, sort of these two brothers kind of running, across the field and falling into each other's arms, kissing and weeping, and saying how grateful they are to each other. There are some things that Jacob does, and it feels important to focus on those, because sometimes those are the things that those kind of action steps, maybe we could understand them now, that may be worth paying attention to when we think about questions like forgiveness or repentance, or redemption, when it comes to this conversation that we're having today. Um, the largest of them is that Jacob makes reparation, about as significantly a gesture of reparation as would have been possible, right? He takes a look at everything that he has, and he sends it forward. He says, "I want, before my brother sees me, I want him to see this this very immense gift." And that he should be able to receive this reparation on my part. The issue of reparations as an action step, I think, is one that certainly comes up whenever we have these conversations about racism in the United States. I think it's significant that we find it here in this story as clearly as that. The other thing that happens is that Jacob, when the actual meeting is meant to take place. Now, this is somebody who's been on the run, right? So this is someone who's had kind of fear perched on his shoulder. He's the one who goes first. He kind of gets everybody organized, but then he's the one who goes out first. And he does it with a posture or a disposition of humility. And to me, maybe the most kind of evocative thing about this story as I reread it is that he says that as he sees Esau, that to see your face is to see the face of God. And this is powerful because just a little bit earlier in the text, there's this question about, is Jacob wrestling with God or with the holy in some kind of significant way? And some language there about, this is the place where I strove, I wrestled with the holy. And to say that to his brother, a brother who he knows he has harmed, who he knows he is responsible in no small way for the breach in their relationship, and for the trials that his brother would have had in those years since, and even the way that he, Jacob, has been able to live his life in those years since. To be able to make that statement, to say, to see your face is to see the face of God, I think is a powerful one, and worth our attention here. So as we pivot to be thinking about the question of wrestling with whiteness, I guess I'll just say, in terms of the way that I'm using language of whiteness here, I think is important. I think using language like this, any language that we would choose, they're tools to have a certain kind of conversation. And I have found in my years of doing anti-racist work, of doing my own personal work and work in community, around my own story, my own journey, inhabiting a white body. There are some things that have been useful to me in kind of building up my resolve and my commitment to do that work. There have been other things that have been, I would say, counterproductive or kind of diminishing in doing that work. And it's challenging because this is work that has really high stakes to it, right? There's no doubt that what we're talking about here has life and death consequences for people who live in our communities across this country. So if people are on edge about that, if we experience ourselves as being on edge, if we experience a little bit less patience or maybe a quickness to anger or frustration, if we might feel some guilt, or someone might tell us you ought to feel some guilt. This is psychically and emotionally, and I would say morally and spiritually, this is complicated stuff to be involved in. But I will also say to you, you know, it's clear to me, in as much as we have not in fact addressed what needs to be addressed in terms of the history of the United States, when it comes to racism, and particularly when it comes to the subjugation of Black and brown bodies. It is clear to me that there are not enough of us in this work. So one of my places of commitment is saying, I don't want to be the kind of person who tries to draw up a huge fortress around the righteous folks who are doing the work and trying to keep out the less righteous people who didn't do the work the right way or used a word that I didn't want them to use. So that's a commitment that I have. And I'm aware in this last few weeks, as much of this has come to the surface once again, that there are people, both white people and people of color, who for different reasons may be in a position of saying, you know, you're in this work the right way or you're in this work the wrong way. And I'm not in a position to try to talk them out of that kind of way of approaching the work. It's just not the way that I want to do the work. And I also feel like it's okay for people to do the work in different ways. So for the folks who make those choices, that's okay. I will share with you, I have some particular suspicion about white people who do a lot of drawing lines. And as a theologian, what it actually reminds me of are theologies of personal salvation. And it raises this question to me because there are certain people of faith who would say, you know, I have accepted Jesus in a way that punches my ticket, and everything else, you know, is neither here nor there. And I don't adhere to faith that way. But I worry when we approach the necessary work around racism like that, as though I could read a book or I could go to a conference or I could become the certain kind of ally that would punch my ticket to being the right kind of white person. And I'll share with you that I am not convinced. I do not find that kind of theology compelling. And I find it to be more often than not a real drag on the momentum of the necessary work that we need to do. So where I would try to locate myself is more in thinking about a theology that liberates, that recognizes that for us, white bodies as well as Black bodies and brown bodies, there is something for all of us that racism has taken from us. And that my work in racism is not charity work, that it is as much to do with my own liberation as a white-bodied person as it is about folks that I care about who have Black and brown bodies. And although liberation looks a very different thing for folks in these different positions, it is no less significant. And I do that work as much for myself as I do for them, because in fact, I believe that liberation is a collective task. And so this isn't about me punching my ticket. It's about me participating in the necessary coalition building, and also about talking to folks in my family, talking to folks in my church, talking to folks at Chicago Theological Seminary, talking to white folks as well as people of color, because it's not the responsibility of people of color to answer all the questions about what's going on with racism. White folks need to be in a position of initiating conversations about racism, pursuing conversations about racism, and ultimately about really leaning into the work of dismantling racist systems. So those are some of my commitments that I want to share with you. And what that means for you, and how I hope you'll join me in this, is where you are right now in this work is good with me. there's no competition here. So if you logged on, or if you're gonna watch this as a recording and you feel like, boy, I'm a total novice, I don't really know kind of where I fit into this, you fit into this. You belong here. We need you in this work. And if you're somebody who's read the most books and been to the most conferences, and you're still excited and committed to doing this work, I'm glad you're here too. And all of us in between those two, we belong in this work. We're needed in this work. And so I want us to be in a position where we feel that for ourselves, and we also empower and embolden one another to feel that way together. So I want to kind of keep our story of Jacob and Esau in our mind as we get into a little bit of hopefully a little bit of kind of reminder of what this anti-racism work is really all about. And Jacob helped me to think about this graphic, and you may have seen this before. You know, sometimes it's depicted actually as an iceberg, and you see this kind of overt racism, overt white supremacy is the kind of tip of the iceberg. And then under the surface, you see just a proliferation of schemes and deceits of covert racism. And I'm reminded of Jacob here because, of course, Jacob wasn't an overtly bad brother, right? Right? He worked all of this in a very transactional way, right? So it wasn't overt, but it was really, really covert, right? And it was intentional, and it was structural in terms of what got put in place. So as you read, you know, again, some of these phrases, some of these agendas, some of these structures of injustice, you know, think about Jacob. Think about the life that he lived and the relationship that he had with Esau. You know, Jacob wasn't out there on the tip of the iceberg saying, I'm gonna go get this, and I'm gonna pull this over on my dad, and you know, my father-in-law, you know, he's not gonna know what hit him. You know, that wasn't the kind of person Jacob was. But Jacob was very resourceful in figuring out how to manipulate a system to continue to perpetuate his material well-being. And that's how white supremacy works. Very, very little of it, particularly now, historically, happens at an overt level. But it is very resilient in re-exerting itself in new adaptations. And so even as we may perceive, you know, are we taking some steps forward right now? Is the energy that we're experiencing in this moment, you know, going to help make some real structural change? I want us to remember the way that whiteness and white supremacy works in our society has proved to be very resilient to reimagine and re-engineer itself to continue to exert certain pressure and power in our society. So even as we do the work to move forward, you know, always just let's stay conscious of that. One of, I think, the most important kind of visual representations that I would share with you when it comes to anti-racist work just happens to be called The Ladder, which was just completely by chance that I could also do a quick tie-in to Jacob, the Great Dreamer, Jacob's Ladder. We can all sing the Vacation Bible School songs in our own time. It's just a wonderful accidental tie-in here. What's shared in this visual is one, as I say, that I just think is crucial for us when we think about white folks doing the work that white folks need to do. And you'll see sort of toward the top of the ladder, you see some of that kind of coalition building, collective action, and kind of communities of love and resistance, right? We're working toward that, but none of us started there, right? Like Jacob, we got born in one kind of way. The more that we work, we're able to kind of move, as it were, up this ladder. There's nothing that looks like attainment or finality here, though, and it's important to say that. You know, these aren't badges on your Boy Scout or Girl Scout, you know, uniform here that says, hey, I've got this down always and forever. And in certain situations, we may be able to show up one kind of way, one of these rungs. In another situation, we may show up on a different rung. And there's real reasons why that happens. So I just want to sort of talk us through that. It's a way for us ultimately to kind of have a tool of kind of self-reflection. You know, where have I been? Where am I right now? Maybe think really reflectively and constructively about what helped me to kind of move, and what do I need so that I don't end up slipping back on some rungs that I want to be done with, but I want to kind of keep sustaining and growing in this work. And when it comes to whiteness, the way that white supremacy within our society works is it first and foremost conveys whiteness is normalcy, right? The kind of standard for everything is whiteness, right? For most of us growing up, you know, a big source of cultural material came through the television set. And for a long time, all of the faces that you would have seen on that television set were likely to be white, right? That's one of the ways that media resources a sort of sense of white equals normal. Now, again, you can sort of think what happens if you're a person of color and you don't see yourself represented in the media in that way, how it would, again, in a converse way, would communicate to you something about my color, something about my non-whiteness is deviant in this cultural paradigm that says that white is standard, white is normal in this way. As we begin to do this work, though, as white folks, and begin to sort of open ourselves to growing on our awareness about this, we start kind of moving up the rungs of this ladder. And there are phases there of kind of naive curiosity, the kind of what are you, kind of beginning to realize that difference is in place there and asking kind of necessary questions about there. There also comes this very very strong, often funded by a kind of liberal ideology, a sort of, you know, we're colorblind, I don't see color, we're all the same, equality, you know, if I don't see you as being different, then you're not different. You know, these kinds of projections are kind of what's showing up there in the Be Like Me. We're all the same. And in fact, if you say that we're not the same, then you're the problem, right? That if you're raising questions kind of beyond color blindness, then you're really the problem here. Because really what we need to do is just imagine that race is not a part of our life. And then we start to get into a little more the kind of thick existential, personal kind of reflective work, right? It initially shows up as denial and defensiveness. And you may recognize that in your own journey around doing this work, or have observed other folks who say, you know, I'm not a racist, and as I say, kind of taking a defensive posture around that. Maybe beyond that is a kind of really a kind of flip of defensiveness, where then a white person might take it all on themselves, of sort of saying, oh my goodness, you know, racism is real. This is a real problem, and I am sort of the sole responsible entity, and really kind of piling up as far as that goes. And for those of us who have maybe spent a fair amount of time there, I also want to share this visual as a way of saying, this is actually not the top of the ladder. We need to continue to work past where white guilt, where white fragility, where white shame sometimes get us really stuck. And if you didn't believe me before when I said I'm not interested in doing anti-racist work that just punishes white people who aren't doing it the right way, part of my suspiciousness about those kinds of approaches is it would seem to kind of cut the ladder off there. It would say, as long as people are miserable, as long as white people feel, you know, this many points guilty and this many points, you know, ashamed of the history of America, then that's all that needs to happen here. That actually doesn't disrupt or interrupt the way that racist systems work. In fact, what often gets in a very toxic way kind of generated in those moments is white resentment and white fear, right? Remember Jacob's fear, always looking over his shoulder, having a sense of, I know I've messed up and I don't know how to stop running. And that fear can become such a toxic thing in this. I'm scared to mess up. I'm scared to say the wrong thing. I don't want to show up to that meeting. I don't want to show up to that protest. I don't want to show up to that conversation because I'm worried that I'm going to fail. And if that's where we stop in this work, or if that's where we get stopped in this work, justice is not a possibility for us in this country. And so we need to be nurturing the kinds of communities, and you all as community leaders have a huge, huge role in this. We need to be about continuing to move forward in this. And when we get stuck in those places, because we will get stuck in those places, there will be stuff that triggers that fear or triggers that guilt or triggers that shame. We got to be attentive and compassionate and merciful to ourselves and to one another in those moments, so that we can once again kind of reopen ourselves, do the kind of acknowledgement work. Right, again, come back to the Jacob story, right? He ultimately comes into a place where, through that reparative act that really precedes any of, kind of Esau's reception or forgiveness that happens in that moment, that reparative act is both an acknowledgement and a kind of a responsibility taking. Now, if it was up to me, Jacob would have been a little bit more clear about his responsibility taking, right? He would have said, hey, you remember when we were back there at Dad's tent? Remember when I was there at the cooking fire? The good brother thing to do would have really just been to feed you. And I didn't do that. I ran that hustle on you, and then I ran it on Dad, and I know you've been, more or less keeping your eye out for me for all these years, right? We don't get that in the story, at least in the biblical account of the story. But there are going to be situations where we need to be as clear about that, right? We need to say what it means to live this life in a white body is to be yoked to the terms of whiteness and white supremacy in this society and in this historical context. I'm not responsible for the whole legacy of racism, but I am absolutely responsible for making the kinds of choices that aid in justice work today and every day after this. And I've got to do that with humility, and I've got to be thinking about what communities I'm a part of. And we'll get there in really in just a second. And if there are more questions about this, we can also kind of come back to this visualization as well. So let's talk a little bit about taking action. And where I want us to really be clear about this is that one of the dilemmas that often faces us in making strategic, effective kind of action steps in our world is that we don't really know where to take, right, the action, right? There's a sort of sense of, okay, I've got a sense of that I want to do this work. Where do I do this work? And so the question then is, what are your spheres of influence? So if you're community leaders, right, what are those community spaces? That would be a sphere of influence. If you're a congregational leader, leading a community of faith, that is a big sphere of influence. Your family, other organizations that you might be a part of, school communities, these are all potential spheres of influence. And I would encourage you, particularly if you're, as you're starting out on this work, I would encourage you to not try to work all of your spheres of influence all at once. You will burn yourself out. Or at least I would burn myself out, and I've never seen a person who can work all their spheres of influence all the time. So I don't want to encourage you to sort of make a list of your sphere of influences and then just like go to town and think, hey, I'm going to do transformative anti-racist work in all these spaces right now. Be strategic in your thinking. Think about each of it's fine to make a list of the sphere of influences. That's a good practice. But as you do that, think about, okay, within this sphere of influence, are there particular opportunities, right? Are there things that are happening in this moment within the sphere of influence that in fact some real constructive action taking could actually lead to some necessary transformation? That's really strategically what you're looking for. And again, we can touch on this a little bit more. One of the things that I've been sort of talking about here in some different ways is this issue of accountability, particularly for people of color for whom the world, because of the terms of white supremacy and whiteness, kind of often gives white folks a pass on stuff, right? If you're a person of color, you're constantly being held accountable for stuff even that you're not responsible to be held accountable for, right? So there's a sort of severe overcompensation of accountability on people of color. For white folks, there's a kind of underfunctioning accountability. So we've got to think about, am I committed to relationships that will help me with accountability? And there's so much that could be said here, but I want to at least say this thing that I put up on the slide, which is I want us to be in accountability relationships that are about calling in instead of calling out. And that's some of the language, again, that you may be very familiar with, right? Oh, Zachary just said something stupid. I'm going to call him out really publicly. I'm going to do this kind of shaming piece, and he's really going to get it. And everybody's going to see that, I'm a better, white anti-racist ally than Zachary is. So that would be an example of calling out. And that happens in this work more than I would like to admit to you. Calling in is a different kind of orientation. Calling in is, I can acknowledge somebody else's misstep here. I'm tuned into that. I observed that. But ultimately what I'm trying to do is not push that person out. I'm trying to call them further into this work, right? So the adjustment to that kind of way of responding to each other is crucial in being able to keep people involved in this work. Because if Zachary just is making a blunder, and everybody sees, Zachary just got slammed for that publicly, what that communicates to everybody else is, I don't want to be the next person to get slammed like that. If instead we engage with each other more constructively than that and say, hey, look, this is a mess up, but I want to call you into this work, and I want to talk about it, and I want to acknowledge that I mess up too, even as I'm talking about you messing up. What that communicates within that community and within those relationships is really predicated on love and on shared commitment and on humility. And if that stuff could be the foundation of us doing the necessary, urgent anti-racist work, we would sustain ourselves more fully in this work going forward. And I'm committed to that, and I want to share that commitment with you. So there's a couple of other things that are going to help us to, really be effective in these spheres of influence, and I want to put them both up here. One is educating ourselves, and there's a clear need around that, but I also don't want to overemphasize or oversell that point. There are many of us, particularly those who have spent a great deal of their life within formal educational settings, like people who have PhD behind their name, for example. This is, sort of gets your brain thinking there is a research solution to this problem, right? If I get the right recommended book list, I'll get this thing settled, right? It's just about the bibliography. I just got to perfect the bibliography. This kind of work is not going to be fully remedied from getting the perfect bibliography. So I want to surface the need for us to educate ourselves. I also want to say, don't imagine that the road to redemption and the road to justice is only predicated on us reading the right books. The other piece that I want to say here, and I'll give some more focus to this in just a minute, is particularly for those of us who are religious leaders and leaders within communities of faith, it is crucially important that we interrogate our theologies when it comes to racism. And so let me just kind of focus a moment on those two here. So I just said that thing about there's not a perfect bibliography. Here are 5 books that if you haven't read them already, I would recommend to you. And some of them I'm sure you've already seen, and many of you have already read. One of the books that is more recent is the book that's right there in the center, My Grandmother's Hands. And it's a powerful book, and it's written more from a perspective that I'm more accustomed to, which is as a counselor, as a chaplain. This is someone who has more of a social work and therapy kind of background, and thinking in very elevated and mature ways about racism and what that does to people, but also thinking in a very holistic way about how people, both white folks and people of color, are impacted by that and influenced by that. So if you haven't seen that one in particular, I would just raise it up to you. But I would recommend all of these, and again, I'm sure you have read these or have much longer bibliographies yourself. The second piece is the one that, again, particularly for who you are in this conversation, I really want to emphasize, and that is we have to interrogate our theologies. We have to recognize that for most of us who received formal seminary training, these books may or may not have existed yet, or may not have been on the syllabus. And so we need to do a little bit to kind of re-educate ourselves and interrogate some of the ways in which we may have gotten developed in as theologians, and those of you who are leading congregations or doing chaplaincy work or other kind of community leadership, you are out there doing theology. So I claim you as being theologians, but then I also want to hold you responsible to continue to nurture yourself by reading the kind of theology that, in my estimation, will help to empower the necessary work. So again, some of these names, all of these names, hopefully are familiar to you. I mean, probably James Cone is one, again, of an older generation. But I would certainly commend to you the work of Kelly Brown Douglas and also Pamela Lightsey. In particular, all of these books are extraordinary. And if you haven't had a chance to read all of them recently, I would just commend every single one of them, again, and more, right, to your reading, because I think they offer really necessary counterpoint maybe to the ways in which our seminary formation and our theological education may have taken place. So this brings us to this video, which I'm going to skip, although I would also commend Eddie Galad to you, because I do want to give a little bit of time for discussion, and I'll go ahead and just move to discussion here. So I'll look to you, Reverend Carey, to give me a little bit of maybe some of the questions off the top that maybe I can respond to.
We got a comment from Nicole Malera in Milwaukee that Alice's Garden, which is a wonderful urban garden ministry, is hosting an Emancipation of Whiteness Labyrinth Walk this week, which is an opportunity to free white folks from what racism takes away, and it is hosted by people of color. And I am watching for other questions to be added to the chat window if there's other commentary or questions from folks. I think folks were absolutely rapt by what you were presenting, Zachary. So. Not seeing anything else being added just yet. We are at, oh, one new message. Here we go. Oh, we have a thank you so much, and this was amazing. Please share again the name of the MSNBC program.
Sure, and actually, it's just about 3 minutes long. I'm okay to share it. I trust that you'll be able to hear this, and if you can't, just give me a signal here, Reverend Carey.
Okay.
America's not unique in its sins. As a country, we're not unique in our evils. To be honest with you, I think where we may be singular is our refusal to acknowledge them. And the legends and myths we tell about our inherent, goodness to hide and cover and conceal so that we can maintain a kind of willful ignorance that protects our innocence. See, the thing is that when the Tea Party was happening, we were saying, pundits, oh, it's just about economic populism. It's not about race. When people knew, social scientists were already writing that what was driving the Tea Party were anxieties about demographic shifts, that the country was changing, that they were seeing these racially ambiguous babies on Cheerios commercials, that the country wasn't quite feeling like it was a white nation anymore. And people were screaming from the top of their lungs, yo, this is not just simply economic populism. This is the ugly underbelly of the country. See, the thing is this, and I'll say this, and I'll take the hit on it. There are communities that have had to bear the brunt of America confronting, white Americans confronting the danger of their innocence. And it happens every generation. So somehow we have to kind of, oh my God, is this who we are? And just again, here's another generation of babies. Think about it, a 2-year-old had his bones broken by 2 parents trying to shield him from being killed. A woman who has been married to this man for as long as I've been on the planet almost, lost her husband. For what? And so what we know is that the country has been playing politics for a long time on this hatred. We know this. So it's easy for us to place it all on Donald Trump's shoulders. It's easy for us to place Pittsburgh on his shoulders. It's easy for me to place Charlottesville on his shoulders. It's easy for us to place El Paso on his shoulders. This is us. And if we're going to get past this, we can't blame it on him. He's a manifestation of the ugliness that's in us. I've had the privilege of growing up in a tradition that didn't believe in the myths and the legends because we had to bear the brunt of them. Either we're going to change, Nicole, or we're going to do this again and again, and babies are going to have to grow up without mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts, friends, while we're trying to convince white folk to finally leave behind a history that will maybe or embrace a history that might set them free from being white. Finally. What else? Lord help us.
There, Chris Hayes from MSNBC, right just below me. Click over on this list to see lots of other.
Professor Moon, could you possibly get me that link? We may need to be sharing that directly with attendees and also on some of our social media for reflection.
Yeah, and there's a lot in that clip. Part of what I appreciated was Dr. Goulard's ability to that was 3 minutes, right? You just heard me talk for almost an hour. In 3 minutes to really encapsulate so much of, I think, what the challenges are, and it's a great point of reflection there. But again, part of what he's encouraging is saying white folks need to recognize that much of what kind of keeps perpetuating racism, continuing to being able to reinvent itself, is that white folks, in fact, have not done the necessary work of acknowledging, of taking responsibility, and ultimately of seeking liberation from racism for themselves, right? That whether we've gotten to the place of thinking, oh, justice work is about, saying that Black Lives Matter, or saying that, equality is possible, but not recognizing that actually there is something that has also been taken from us as a part of this, and that if we don't do this work, there is a diminishment to our own humanity within these white bodies that racism has also taken from us. And the only way to address that, the only way to remedy that deficit that we run, is to be involved in this kind of justice work. And I think that's crucial for us to be able to consider that.
I am aware of the time. I know we have come to the hour mark, and I'm sure there are some people who have to get to their next meetings. I will leave a little bit of room for a couple more questions if people need them. One question: I struggle with the realization that I live and move and have my being in a predominantly white community. I can educate myself, but perhaps I need to be more intentional about interacting with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. At the same time, that sounds a bit paternalistic.
It depends on how you do it, right? Like so much in relationship has to do with that. I think it's whenever I think about relationship, I think a little bit about like the do's and don'ts of any good relationship, right? If you were to go on a first date with somebody and say, hey, I've been educating myself about somebody like you for a long time, and I really think I've got it down. Let me talk to you about that. That may be a sort of awkward, if not just total debacle of a first date, right? If instead you think about, hey, what prepares us well to be in a relationship? I need to understand myself. I need to understand my own story. And I need to come with some openness and some interest in a kind of posture of caring in this relationship, right? That first date is going to go a lot better, right? You're going to be able to talk about yourself a little bit. You're also going to be able to open up your ears and really hear about who this new person is. Love is a probably the most powerful force in our universe, and it gets people who are different connected all of the time with each other, right? Any of us who are in any kind of long-term relationship with a partner or a spouse or family or children, or even work colleagues over many years, that you recognize that without love, that relationship isn't able to maintain itself. And love also has a way of being able to bring people together who are very different, right? And I'll just let you sort of think about some of the folks, even in communities that are mostly maybe overwhelmingly white, there are still a lot of differences in those communities as well. And so I think we may be so familiar with the particular worlds that we're used to inhabiting that, again, we sort of think, oh, well, this is it, this is all I have, and another world, seems less familiar and less possible. And I would just encourage you, I think all of you have found ways to love people who are really different than yourself, and that love is the thing that will take you forward. Asking the question around, is this paternalistic, is a question that if you inhabit a white body, you have to be asking all of the time. Am I being quiet in this moment actually as an act of passive paternalism? Am I talking too much as a sort of overfunctioning kind of paternalism? Am I seeking this person out for these kind of paternalistic reasons? That is a really useful question to kind of keep on our radar screen for self-reflection, and listen for feedback about that, right? Folks will also let you know, hey, this isn't working for me, and be conscious of how you respond in that moment too. Because if someone gives you some real sincere feedback and you show up in that kind of defensive posture, oh, no, that's not what I meant, or, oh, no, that isn't what I said, you misunderstood me, or you misheard me, or this kind of thing, right? What we're saying is, hey, I don't want that feedback. And trust me, if you start closing yourself off from feedback from people that you want to be in a loving relationship with, that is not going to be a sustainable relationship. You got to figure out a way to be open to that feedback. It's necessary feedback. And as I say, I think love is the thing that's going to be able to carry us into those relationships and hold us in that relationship. But it's not a foregone conclusion that there aren't going to be some mistakes or there aren't going to be some missteps as a part of that as well.
One of our participants has a comment about how far the white normative reaches. For the first time, she heard herself referred to as a person of white last week. And that caused her to do some reflecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's crucial. I mean, in this presentation, I've used language around white bodies. I think people of white, I have sometimes used language around being melanin deficient, right? Rather than saying people of color have something sort of extra to them, that it's actually, whiteness is actually a deficit rather than, something that's normative and everything else is deviant from that normativity. Again, I encourage all of us around that point of reflection, because I think many of us, I mean, really all of us, have been bombarded with different messages about what whiteness means and what it entails, and what not being white means and what that entails. And so I think, again, one of those kind of ongoing places of a point of reflection is to be, being serious about what those messages are and how we may carry those messages in our thinking and in our doing. And also the language that's most useful for us. There isn't perfect language. That's the reason why people keep coming up with new terms. And look, I'm a theologian, right? We love to make up our own words too. So keep looking for the language that frames it in a way that is helpful and helps you to grow and helps you to learn. I think all of that is really helpful. And if the language that I use in this presentation is not your preferred language, I'm okay with that, because I think when language attempts to be determinative and say, these are the right words, if we all use these words, then this wouldn't be an issue. I'm highly suspicious of that. So find the language that helps you to do the work that you're ready to do right now.
A couple of appreciations here as we wrap up. One person said, "This is really hard work. Thanks for leading us into a better way of being human." And someone else is grateful that we'll be receiving the video and is asking if we have permission to share it with others.
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know. I mean, this is something that I'm doing in partnership with the Wisconsin Council of Churches. But as far as I'm concerned, yes. I mean, I'm happy for these ideas to be shared, and I support anything that helps to resource the necessary reflection and the necessary conversations that really are the kind of lay the groundwork for us to be able to do good action. And I would say to you, along those lines, because there is a lot of material out there, there can be some of that what was smartly coined at one point, analysis paralysis, right? To sort of stay with the reading material so long that you don't actually kind of move toward action. I think one of the things that's really crucial here is for us to understand how we need to be engaged with, again, here's another, made up word, praxis, right? How are we doing the kind of learning and reflection that we need to do? And then how is that in relationship to our behavior and the action that we're taking? And this is a great moment because there is some action being taken. So it's good for us to do that. We also don't want to lose touch with our need to continue to reflect and continue to learn. So allow those two to be good dance partners with each other, and recognize that our actions are strengthened when we do good reflective and learning work, and our reflection and learning is really enlivened and animated by the action steps that we take. So both of those are so crucially important to be in relationship with each other, if what our goal is to kind of continue to learn and to strengthen ourselves and strengthen our communities. Make sure that we're giving ourselves and one another opportunities to do both those things in relationship with each other.
Professor Moon, thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon, for taking the time out of your sabbatical to prepare, to reflect with us. I am indeed grateful on behalf of the community of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We have a resource page that we're developing for the council, knowing that some folks are familiar with their own denominational resources, but perhaps not other denominations. And so we'll be pulling that together, and we'll make sure that we include what you've recommended on that page as well. If you've been here in this webinar today, we will get the recording out to you, a copy of the PowerPoint out to you with the list of the books, and a link to the MSNBC clip. Make sure you check your spam folder. Sometimes our mass emails do end up there. So if you haven't seen that by tomorrow morning, make sure you look there. Grateful for all of your ministries. Go with God's blessing. Go in peace.